started. So good morning, everybody. This is Lisa Pierce, and I'm very happy to be hosting this session, which I think a lot of us have a very genuine interest in the topic as part of I Am Jack's events. I know Lynne personally and professionally. Lynne Golodner is also a marketer, so she speaks our language, and she is the executive director of the Great Lakes Civility Project. We are hosting this session kind of under our umbrella to deepen understanding and enable good conversations, both at work and with those we interact with and love. So with that, I will turn things over to Lynne. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Welcome, everybody. If you could all kindly mute your microphones, that'd be great. And feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go along. I'm going to read a little bit of an introduction so you know who we are and what we're doing, and then we will get started. So Nolan Finley began his newspaper career as a copy boy at the Detroit News while a senior in college. After a brief stint with the Jackson Citizen-Patriot, he returned to the news as a reporter and has since served as the newspaper's city editor, business editor, politics editor, and deputy managing editor. In 2000, Nolan was named editorial page editor, where he directs the expression of the newspaper's editorial position on various national and local issues. His columns have appeared in the newspaper ever since. Nolan graduated from Schoolcraft College and Wayne State University, and in 2012 was inducted into the Michigan Journalism Hall of Fame. He is a co-host of One Detroit on Detroit Public Television. Stephen Henderson is an American journalist who won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Commentary and the 2014 National Association of Black Journalists Journalist of the Year Award while writing for the Detroit Free Press. A native of Detroit, Stephen is a graduate of the University of Detroit Jesuit High School and the University of Michigan. Since 2015, he has been host of Detroit Today on WDET. In 2020, Stephen founded Bridge Detroit, where he serves as executive advisor. He has worked for the Baltimore Sun, the Chicago Tribune, the Lexington Herald Leader, and Knight Ridder. Stephen is also a co-host of One Detroit and host of American Black Journal on Detroit Public Television. Nolan and Stephen together created the Great Lakes Civility Project in 2020 with the goal of bringing their experiences and their friendship as evidence that it is possible to cross difficult political divides and even choose to be in close relationships with people who believe differently than you. Since 2020, they have spoken to audiences across America, driven by a goal of empowering people with the tools and understanding to have difficult conversations civilly and to bring civility into workplaces, relationships, and communities. I'm here as Executive Director of the Civility Project, and you can learn more at greatlakeCivilityProject.com, which I'll put in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Stephen and Nolan to start our conversation. And as you have questions, please have the chat and I will weave them into the conversation. So Stephen and Nolan, take it from here. Who wants to go first?
I don't know. Who's going first, Nolan? Me?
I think you are, Steve.
I'm going first. Okay.
Well, you look bright and sunny this morning.
I'm hanging in there. So it is great to be with all of you. Nolan and I are always really pleased to bring this message to different audiences around the country, and of course here in Southeast Michigan. There is, I think, a special urgency to the kinds of things that we talk about right now that makes this even more important for us to be talking about as a community. We're 7.5, maybe 8 weeks away from a presidential election that has lived up to every bit of the hype as being one of the most divisive in history. I mean, you hear and read that phrase, I feel like, everywhere right now, and of course you can witness it, on television and on social right now. The number of ads that appear when you're just trying to watch your show or whatever. And the nastiness of those ads. I mean, the absolute in some cases, just vile kinds of things that are being said by one side about the other. And so that's an important background for this conversation. You know, it used to be we'd have a presidential election every 4 years, and for a couple of years, you know, people would kind of retreat to their corners a bit and let the new administration figure things out and get some stuff done and then react to it. Now, I think we all know that no matter what happens on November 5th, the counter campaign to the outcome starts at midnight that night. So, as soon as the race is declared one way or another. I think the best way to describe what Nolan and I are trying to do and have now been trying to do for the past 4 years is to create a profile perhaps in front of that backdrop that offers a contrast. If you have ever seen me and Nolan, if you've ever heard me and Nolan, you know we are very, very different. We don't share a lot in common. And when it comes to politics and policy, we share almost nothing in common. And despite that, we have found a way over about 17 years to be able to have as bitter and passionate a conversation or an argument as you want about those politics, about those policies. We have been able to learn to do that without damaging the actual relationship that we have, that we actually have a strong enough relationship that allows us to have those kinds of disputes, to have those kinds of arguments and not have it damage the relationship. We've been doing this, like I said, for about 17 years. We started when I came home to Detroit from several years working in Washington, and became the editorial page editor at the Detroit Free Press. Nolan had already for about a decade, in fact, been the editorial page editor at the Detroit News. If you know anything about newspapers in this town, Free Press is liberal, the News is conservative. It didn't take people very long to look at the two of us and say, geez, they're quite different. I bet if we put them together someplace on stage or on air, they'll get in a fight. And we did many times, over and over. Almost any subject you would ask us about, we could have a very spirited argument about. But something started to happen while we were doing this more and more, which was very entertaining for lots of people. We spent a lot of time together and we started to talk about other stuff. What are you interested in? What do you do when we're not fighting on stage? What do you do when you're not editing the newspaper? That kind of thing. And we discovered that we actually had more things in common than we thought and actually kind of liked each other. This was great surprise, of course, to us, but also to people around us who kind of would pull us aside and say, I see you with that guy a lot. What's going on there? How can you even stand that person? How can you be friends with that person? But it seemed to us to make sense. I mean, we were perfectly okay with the idea that we might be friends, even though we had no hope or no aspiration even to figure out how to agree on things. So this is in 2007, 2008. If you think about it, that's 17 years ago, about the same kind of time that we're in now, coming up on a presidential election. It was a very bitter and divided time in the country. But if you fast forward from there 8 years to 2016, and think about how much more bitter and divided things were after that election, when Donald Trump was elected president. This incredible backlash that it inspired. I remember really clearly the number of people who told me after the election and before Thanksgiving that they were going to have to skip Thanksgiving dinner that year because so-and-so and their family was going to be there and they voted for the other person and they didn't want to talk about that. I mean, it was the first time I heard the number of people talk about skipping things with their family because of politics. If you fast forward from then to now, 8 more years, are things better or are they worse? I think we would all agree they're getting worse. And that's why Nolan and I have started to really think about, well, what works between the two of us? That 17 years, the country seems to be coming apart over. We have just kind of managed, I mean, we don't agree about the things that are happening. We have just as spirited argument now as we did when we first met each other about those things. But we managed to maintain a very good friendship between us. And so we started to ask, what are the things that we're doing? What are the things that we've learned over that 17 years to do or not do that make that possible? And is it possible for us to share those things with other people who seem to be having a really hard time figuring out how to relate to people who are different and who think differently? And so that's where the Civility Project came from. We've come up with a real examination of what happens between the two of us. We've devised 4 pillars that we believe define the kind of boundaries and the rules that we observe or try to observe with each other, and have made it possible for us to do this. And what we hope people take from it is the idea that no one of us as individuals can solve, the big picture incivility or partisan divide problems that we have in this country. I think a lot of us feel quite helpless, in fact, when we think about that. But yes, there are things that each of us can be doing in the spaces where we live our lives, in the communities where we have a role, we have agency. We can do things differently, and we can reach different outcomes in relationships, even with people who we bitterly disagree with. I mean, who we just can't see eye to eye with. And so what we'll do over the next hours, we'll talk about those pillars and hopefully leave you with some of those tools to be able to go make that change in your own lives.
And I put the graphic of the pillars in the chat, so if anybody wants to download it, they have it.
Yeah, and thanks, Lynn. And thanks, Steve. I don't think that the chemistry between Steve and I is anything unique. This isn't some, we're able to overcome our differences and talk with each other in these trying times and divided times because we have some sort of unique chemistry. It's very intentional, and there are certain things we do that allows this relationship to continue and to continue to be productive. And when we first started out, I mean, we were doing these things without really, defining them and without really being able to put them into words or onto paper. But we did notice that unlike most of America who are on different sides of the political divide, we were able to have productive conversations where others couldn't. And we know that we all know that we are becoming increasingly divided, but also increasingly angry. It's not just that we disagree, it's that we're starting to hate each other because of our disagreements. And that's a very dangerous place for the country to be. Before the last election, 2020, I think, or 2022, I read a stat that said 72% of people don't talk to other people who don't share their political beliefs. They don't talk politics with them. And if we're not talking, I don't know how we can get past our fear of each other and our budding hatred of each other. I mean, we've got to be able to sit down across from each other and have meaningful discourse and productive dialogue. And, as Steve mentioned, this seems so alien to the people around us when we began our friendship, because people do tend to bunker up. They tend only to associate with the people they're comfortable with politically. They echo my views, so I enjoy talking to them. Or on the other hand, they challenge my views, so I'd rather avoid them. So we're not trying to get people here. We'd never say that our mission is for people to agree to disagree. Our mission is to for people to agree to disagree and keep disagreeing and not avoid the hard conversations. We want you to disagree and find value in the disagreement, because we find value in our disagreement, in our arguments, in our debates and discussions. We find considerable value in that. And I think that's what these tips we're going to be talking about, will help get you there. I mean, we've all seen divided times in this country before. I was, coming of age during the Vietnam War when, the government was shooting kids on campuses. I mean, it doesn't get much more divisive than that. And, we've always been able to, in some fashion, come back together, whether it was the civil rights movement, other devices.
Nolan, I think you're cutting out here.
History during this time, it feels like we're coming apart in a much more dangerous and a way in which we might not be able to come back from if we.
I think we may have lost Nolan there. Okay, so Stephen, Nolan, are you there?
I hope, can you see me? Or can you hear me?
Yeah, you've been cutting in and out, so we weren't sure if we lost you or not.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Do we want to jump into the 4 pillars? We do have a great question in the chat. Should I throw that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Let's keep it as informal today.
Yeah, so Tom asked, what do you think stops either major political party from taking a step back from the divisiveness?
Oh, I'd like to take a crack at that one. I think our major political parties today are driven more by partisanship than they are principle. And I think both, Steve, when these parties truly stood for something other than winning power, it wasn't like we're seeing in this election cycle where we have candidates willing to change their positions, long held positions, things that define them politically, and take new positions just to get elected, and to acknowledge that they're taking these positions, or to have people around them acknowledge that they're taking these positions just to get election. Principle has become a rare commodity in our politics today. It's all about partisanship. I've got to win this office for my party and hold this office for my party. It has very little to do for America with bettering our lives. It's all about political power. And I don't remember a time when that was as true as it is today. And I don't remember a time when Congress, where you'd have almost, everybody in one party voting the same way and almost everybody in the other party voting the same way. I come up at a time when there were liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats and a lot of people in between, and you had to work to build coalitions of from the two parties in order to get anything accomplished. And right now it's just raw power. It's if we hold the majority, we're going to all vote together to do what we want, and then 4 years later we'll lurch in the other direction and they'll undo everything the other party done. And so there's no forward progress, or very little forward progress being made.
There are some structural things as well that I think contribute to the party's incalcitrance about this. One of them is something that we have at least started to solve here in Michigan, and that is the fact that for forever, we have allowed parties and politicians to choose their constituents rather than having us as constituents choose who represents us in Lansing or Washington. And the instinct as that process has become more driven by data and computers and things that can be very exact, has been to draw what they call very safe seats, seats where one party is almost always guaranteed to win. And if you're the party in control, you're going to draw those districts in a way that not only benefits you, but by extension benefits the other party. Their seats are as safe as yours. You're just going to try to draw fewer of them than you would for yourself. What that means is that the people running in those districts have almost no obligation to appeal to people who think differently. They end up appealing to the most extreme, in fact, instincts of either party. And so as that's gone on, cycle after cycle after cycle, what you've seen is both parties move to the edges in terms of the way that they think and in terms of the way they politic. Now, again, we've changed that here in Michigan in 2018. We voted to take that process away from politicians and give it to voters. Now a group of ordinary citizens sits around and tries to figure out what the districts look like. They are not doing a perfect job. There were a number of things that didn't go exactly the way we wanted them to. Some things actually did go quite well. They went so well, in fact, that a group of politicians in Detroit decided to file suit and overturn it because they were very worried about how that would play out. So we're in a push and pull right now about how that's going to work. But making that process part of what voters decide, giving it to voters, is a step in the right direction. One other thing, of course, is the unbridled presence of money in politics, and that has changed as well over the last 12 or 13 years, because the Supreme Court had decided, after 260 some years of existence, that all of a sudden money and speech were inseparable in terms of the Constitution. Never been true before, is true now. We're seeing the results, which is that all kinds of money that we don't see, that we don't know who's responsible for, is influencing the parties. That has an effect of pushing them into corners, of letting extremes get hold of our politics and our politicians and keep them from working together, keep them working against each other. Nolan and I tried to pitch the idea of a session like this for incoming legislators in Lansing here, and the response, we got close to them being able to do it and thinking that it was a good idea. In the end, one of the leaders on one of the sides said he was worried that if the people in his caucus got along with, started building relationships with people across the aisle, it would be harder for him to control them, to control the way that they were voting, and to get them to do what the party wanted. I thought it spoke volumes about
Absolutely.
about not just the partisanship, but the thing that Nolan's talking about with control. Excuse me.
So then, before we get too far into it, let's run through the pillars, and we'll have leave time at the end for questions. But we don't want to get to the end here and not having gone through our 4 points. And we always start with the main pillar of this project and our beliefs on how we can do better, with dropping assumptions. We all, or most of us, make assumptions about people as soon as we learn a little information about them. You're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're conservative, you're liberal, you're Christian, Jewish, you're Muslim. We hear those words, those descriptors, and we start running through our mind our perceptions and our assumptions about who that person is. And we act on those assumptions to form opinions about those people without doing the work, bothering to do the work of determining whether we're right or not. We don't work hard enough to fill the gaps in knowledge. We allow assumptions to fill the gaps in our knowledge and about another person. And I always tell a story about at the beginning of this project, Steve and I were up on Mackinac Island in northern Michigan. It's a resort community. We were there for the Republican State Policy Conference. It's a gathering of GOP lawmakers and activists and what have you, where they discuss, policy in the next generation of political candidates, et cetera. And it's, it was a place where Steve was probably a lot less comfortable than I was as a progressive Democrat leaning journalist. But we were both up there covering the event for our respective papers. And so we get done, file our copy into the day. We walk down to the main drag and we find a bar and we sit down and we're having a drink together. And of course, there's a big party going on, all these Republicans down there, celebrating, if you will. And, we're sitting there a while and I get up to use the restroom and I walk across the floor and these two women jump me as I'm going across the floor. They pounce on me. That really doesn't happen to me often in bars, but, they were upset. And I knew these women. They ran a conservative website dedicated really to bashing Barack Obama and specifically the Obama administration's policies on the auto industry. It was that time we were going through the bankruptcies and bailouts of the auto industry. So anyway, they jumped me as I was walking and said, "Nolan, is that Steve Henderson you're sitting with over there?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Do you like him? Is he your friend?" And I said, "Well, yeah, he's my friend. I like him very much." And they said, "Oh, we just hate him. He is so horrible." And, those words kind of stopped me because they were talking about someone, I had a very nice relationship with and was quite fond of. And I said, "You hate him?" They said, "Yeah, we hate him." And I said, "Do you know him?" I said, "No, we don't know him." "You ever talk to him?" "No, we've never talked to him." And so I pointed over to my seat and I said, "My chair is empty. Why don't you go over there and spend a little time talking with Steve?" And to their credit, they did. And to Steve's credit, he was open to it. He didn't go running out the door when they plopped down. And so they talked and they talked and they talked. And about 90 minutes later, I'm watching, the ice is now completely melted in my drink. And I say, I'm going to walk over there and break this up, rescue Steve, if you will. And so I go over there and I'm kind of leading Steve away. And as we're leaving the place, I asked these ladies, I said, "Well, what do you think?" And they said, "Oh my goodness." And I thought to myself, 90 minutes, nothing about Steve had changed in that amount of time. His views were exactly the same. Nothing about these two women had changed. Their views were exactly the same. What had happened is they took the time to talk to each other, to ask each other questions, to ask the why questions. Why do you feel this way? Why are you so angry? Why are you upset? And they walked away with a whole different perception of each other and replaced the assumptions with the actual. Isn't the point, but they did come to a level of understanding, which is the first step to gaining the respect you need to have for a civil conversation. And we thought at that moment, if we could just get more people to do that, to sit down and have the conversation of, why why you're this or why you're that, or why do you think these things, and try to gain an understanding of that, that we could get people to start talking to each other, people who normally wouldn't talk to each other. And from there, we started putting together larger groups of people of different opinions, and having them meet in bars, and not to talk and argue about politics, but to talk about who they are. And we think that is an essential exercise, asking those questions. Why do you feel this way? What is it in your background that has formed your opinions? Because our sort of fundamental principle is that all good people come to their opinions in the same way. They take the information and the data available, they run it through the filters of their own experiences and personal values, and they come up with a viewpoint. If that viewpoint is different than yours, if it's different than mine, it doesn't mean they're stupid, ill-informed, evil, trying to do you harm. It just means they've lived a different life and they've had different experiences. They hold different values. Understanding those experiences and those values, again, is the key step toward restoring civility in our discourse, because it is hard once you know who a person is, and once you understand what they've been through that have caused them to believe the things they believe, or to support the things they support. It's much harder to judge them based on assumptions. And we think that respect building process is essential. So, but once you get to that point, once you respect each other, you got to move on then to the actual conversation, which is, I think we'd all agree, far more difficult than that sounds, because talking to people who don't agree with you, who you're suspicious of, who you are afraid might, report you to somebody for sharing your views. And that's a fraught process. And most of us would rather not engage. We're much more comfortable, staying in our bubbles and our bunkers. But once you've made that decision that there's someone you think you would value a relationship with, if you could simply learn to talk across your divides, we ask people to sit down and try the conversation, but to do so first by setting honest goals for the outcome of that conversation. And we can talk a lot about what honest goals are, but one thing an honest goal isn't is to win that conversation, to go in thinking, I'm going to engage with this person and I'm going to so beat them into the table with the superiority of my intellect and the strength of my argument that I'm just going to destroy them. I think we'd all agree that doesn't sound like very much fun. And so we say that a conversation is not a competition. You're not engaging with the goal of winning. There's nothing to win here. An honest goal is to approach a conversation with the hopes of learning something from another person, adding to your sort of store of information, to understanding that person better. Steve and I rarely, if ever, come to an agreement when we have these conversations. There's very few times one of us says, okay, you're right. But almost every time we come together, we take away some sort of value from the conversation, because one, we learned something we didn't know before. We've been able to test our arguments against the other person's arguments. And we come out with a greater understanding of each other, even after all these years of talking. And we're able to get there because we don't just simply sit and shout and trying to win a conversation by being the loudest or the most prolific person in the room. And so, set that honest goal. We want to learn. We're not trying to convert. You're not going to convert somebody anyway, because, I've been talking to Steve all these years, sharing my wisdom, the bright light of my truths, and he never converts. He never comes around. if you ever did, I'd probably just say, well, life's over for me. It's not worth living anymore, I enjoy the disagreements. I find value in them. It's that you're going to ask more questions than you offer opinion. You're going to ask more questions to the other person than you spend time offering your views. You're going to create an environment when that person really believes you want to learn something about them. And that takes some of the heat and some of the fear and some of the suspicion out of a conversation when you approach it with that mindset. I always come in with the idea that, hey, I might be wrong about this part of this issue or all of this issue. I want the information to sort of test whether I'm wrong or not. And that requires leaving your self-righteousness at the door, leaving your smugness at the door. If you come in thinking, well, gosh, I already know everything I need to know. No, my goal is to depart that information to the other person. You've got to come in willing to live. The late Congressman John Ding at one time, when he was taking call after call from environmentalists who were upset about a piece of legislation he had introduced, and he finally hung up. He put his head on. And I think we should keep in mind that the person on the other side of the table believes as passionately in the things that are important to them as you do. Understand that they also think they hold the truth, and you've got to be understanding that they have valid reasons for thinking the way they think.
Thanks, Nolan. So Stephen, we've just talked about dropping assumptions and setting honest goals for the conversation.
Mhm.
Do you want to address points 3 and 4, listening,
Yeah,
keep returning
sure.
to the conversation?
Yeah. So, once you drop your assumptions about somebody and decide to have a conversation and set an honest goal for that conversation, you actually do have to sit down and talk with them, and you've got to listen to them. And we use that word a little differently, I think, in the Civility Project than most of us probably use in our everyday lives. I think most of us would say we're listening when we're not talking, right? We're listening when we're giving someone else a chance to talk. But I think if we press a little further into that, we know that that's not always the case. Sometimes when someone else is talking, we're busy thinking about what we're going to say as soon as they're done talking, right? When it's our turn again. Or we're judging what they're saying while they're saying it. We're talking about a kind of listening that represents more of an investment in the other person and their ideas than just letting them talk. Really committing to the idea of exchanging ideas among you rather than just kind of trading declarations about those ideas. It's not that easy to do. And I think most of us get trained not to do it. We get trained very easily to kind of shut out the active listening that we're talking about. So I have a couple of tests for myself to check whether I'm actually listening when I'm talking with somebody, especially somebody with whom I disagree. The first test is when they're done talking, could you repeat back what they just said? Maybe not word for word, but in good faith, represent the points they were trying to make as though I were them. Could you stand in someone else's shoes, for instance, for about 5 minutes and make the argument from their side of the disagreement? It is a lot harder to do than it sounds, and it requires an incredible amount of investment in what that person's saying, really trying to understand where that person's coming from and the kinds of things that they're trying to convey with the things that they're saying in the conversation. The second test I have for myself about listening is whether I have questions for the other person when they're done. I find that when I'm really listening to somebody, I'm actually curious about the things that they've said, even if I vehemently disagree with the point they're trying to make. Uh, Even if, and this happens more and more in our current culture, even if I'm offended by something that they've said, I find offense in the argument that we're having. If I'm really listening and trying to listen and trying to exchange ideas, I'm curious about what that person's saying. Maybe they said something I didn't quite get. Maybe they said something I hadn't heard before. Maybe they said something I really need to know more about before I decide what I think. I think asking those questions is terribly important. It is part of the substantive exchange of ideas that I think is one of the bedrock principles of civil conversation. The fact that we're not just talking at each other, to and with each other. It is also an important language cue. And I think this is very important, especially right now, where language cues are more difficult to decipher, I think, partially because of social media and electronic technology that take us away from face-to-face. But when I ask somebody a question about what they've said, when I try to dig deeper into where they got what they are saying, or why they believe what they're saying, or what outcome they hope for as a result of what they believe, I am signaling that curiosity. I am signaling that interest in them and their ideas. In our language, that interrogative form is more welcoming and shows more interest than the declarative form, me just saying what I think in response to what they've said. And so, that curiosity, that questioning is a critically important part of the listening that we're talking about, people being able to do. Ask questions about the things that the other person has said to find out more, but also to signal your interest in having an exchange with them. So that's the third pillar of our civility blueprint.
We're losing our voices, Steve.
Yeah, I know. I'm talking way too much these days.
So we have a great question in the chat.
Huh?
In your opinion, is politics the only driver for the rise of incivility in the U.S.?
No. I mean, clearly cultural differences have been perhaps even more dangerously divided than political issues, and then they've all become blended together. Our culture and our politics have all become so intertwined. But no, I don't think politics is the only divider. We're divided on just about everything.
Yeah, religion, region of the country, the things you hear about people who live in this place versus people who live in that place.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of reasons that we're separated. I want to make sure we get to the fourth pillar before we run out of time, and then we can take more questions from
right.
The fourth pillar is the commitment that I think we're asking people to make in this space. This is really hard work, and it doesn't happen in a single conversation. Sometimes it doesn't happen in a single series of conversations. It is difficult to develop the kind of relationship and trust that we're talking about in order to have the most difficult conversations and not have them boil over to the point where they do damage to the relationship. In 17 years of having arguments and disagreeing about things, neither Nolan nor I has ever gotten up from one of those arguments and said, that's it, I'm done with this, I'm gonna walk away. Sometimes that has been about the fact that it was work for both of us and we had to be there. Many more times, and I think over time, it has become more of the sign of investment that we both have in the exchanges that we enjoy together, that both of us see value in talking with the other person beyond any one subject that we might be talking about, or beyond any one conversation that we might be having. We know that coming back has some value to us, that there is something of value in that exchange, in that next conversation, that's not worth walking away from. It's a really difficult thing to do, especially right now, where there are lots of easy ways to walk away from people. I was talking earlier about, the number of people who were walking away from families after the 2016 election, people who were not even willing to go to a holiday dinner with their relatives because of the way that they felt about politics. Think about social media, a place that many of us spend an awful lot of time. Think of all the ways that we can walk away there. I can mute you, I can block you, I can unfriend you, I can push you out of the social circle that I've created. And of course, I do those things and I say I did it, I block that person, I'll never speak to that person again, and everybody else cheers, right? The culture reinforces the value of doing that. We're asking people to make a very different choice in these spaces, and to say it is easier to walk away, but it's more valuable to stay. It is more, there is more to be gained from continuing a conversation, even when it gets difficult, even when maybe it gets hurtful, or there's real resentment that's present in it. There's more value to be gained by staying and trying to work through that than there is in walking away. And that's, again, it is really important in the places where we have agency. And that's what we're talking about here, is places where you can actually do things differently and make a difference. There are lots of places that none of us can control, where things are really broken, where our politics are really broken, and where our dialogue is really awful. We're talking about the places that you actually have control, your family, your neighborhood, the other communities that you belong to, the work community, if you belong to a school community or a religious community. Those are the places where you can decide that things can be different, and where you have equal footing with other people to make that happen. That's the opportunity I think each of us has, and in some ways it's the responsibility each of us has to push back against the culture of incivility that has really taken over so much of our dialogue.
Yeah, and I would add that, there's some principles that we adhere to, or some rules we adhere to, because you should have boundaries. And one of our boundaries is, we never make it personal. In all these years, no matter how passionately our arguments have become, we never say you're a blank. We never make that argument and the disagreement personal, and assign some sort of really nasty negative quality to the other person. We watch our words in that regard, because we've found, and I think probably most people would agree, that words linger a lot longer than actions, and people will forget what you do far more readily than what you've said. And so we watch our words and we don't make it personal. The other thing is we keep things in perspective. As much as we'd like to believe that we're going to change the world if we can just get the other person to agree with us, that's not really true. I mean, it's important, I think, to be passionate about politics. It's important to have strong views on policy, but keep this perspective that it's not all about you and you prevailing in your arguments with another person. The personal relationship is far more important than, changing someone's political views. Ask yourself why it's so important that, another person in your life who you should be close to or like to be close to, why is it so important that they agree with us the same way, they agree with you and feel the same way about things that you do? I mean, what changes really in the world if that happens? We did a session a year or so ago with a nonprofit group. Afterwards, a young woman said, I've got this issue with my husband and his father. Says, they just hate each other because one's a Democrat and one's a Republican. They can't be in the same room with each other now. And she said, my husband and I want to start a family, but I don't really want to bring a child into this environment where the two people who are supposed to love them hate each other, can't abide each other because of their political differences. And I could not imagine what was so important to them in terms of politics that they were willing to risk this, what should be the closest and most important relationship in their lives. Why did they put politics on such a high pedestal that they were willing to lose that love, if you will, and that relationship? Keep things in perspective and remember that there are forces out there, and Steve mentioned social media, but there are forces out there that profit from our division, whether it's the political parties, the social media, the cable television, the politicians. Take a look at, watch the ads that are running now. I watched a 15-minute stretch of television the other night in which there were 9 political ads. 8 of them were all about telling me how afraid I should be about another, member of the other party getting elected. Only one ad was from someone who said, I'm going to do great things for you. Here are my ideas. This is what I stand for. All the rest of them were about fear mongering. And, that's contributing mightily to these divisions. And there are people who are reaping great benefit from that. So, don't forget that as you're getting all worked up and unable to see the value in another person.
So we only have a few minutes left, and we do have a question that might end us on a hopeful note, which is always nice. But Tom asked, is there a politician that each of you admire, either in Michigan or nationally, that do a good job of working across the aisle, as they say?
Yeah, I mean, we've been very close in this work with both Fred Upton and Debbie Dingell, who have led an effort in Congress, this Problem Solvers Caucus, to bring a commitment to bipartisanship and to ending this sort of all or nothing attitude that one side's got to win and the other side's got to lose. And so those two, in fact, they wrote the foreword to our upcoming book. And
yes, yeah, we have a book coming out in May of next year with Wayne State University Press. So you guys should all look for that. But yes, Fred and Debbie did write the foreword to it, so we're really grateful for that. Stephen, do you have anyone you want to name?
Obviously, Fred and Debbie are great examples of that. But I'm going to push back a little bit on the premise of the question. I think we are told over and over again that nobody can get along and nothing can get done in Lansing or in Washington. And it is true that on the kind of bright line issues, some of the premier issues that people are paying attention to, we do have really deep divides. But if you look at what they do most of the time, there's an awful lot of legislation that gets passed across bipartisan lines. Even in Lansing right now, where Democrats have their first very slim majority for the first time in 40 years, a lot of the things that have gotten done have had to coax people from the other side over, and there were Democrats who said, I can't vote for that. There is the kernel of that kind of cooperative work in all of these places and in many of these people. I think we've got to start encouraging that and kind of celebrating it a little more, and downplaying how quote unquote little of it actually exists, because the truth is that on a great many things they are able to work together. There are places where it's to their advantage for sure to come out and seem extreme and seem very distant from the other side and act as though they would never work with them. But I think the reality looks just it looks a little different than that.
Yeah, so I want to thank Jack Morton and Lisa Pierce for bringing us to Jack Morton. This has been really great. I wish we had more time with you guys to hear more of your questions, but I have put a link in the chat for our website where you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. It only comes out once a month. We will not spam you, but with lots of resources and opportunities to participate in more civility building opportunities and experiences. And we have lots of events on our calendar. We'd love to talk with you guys further. And stay tuned for our book that's coming out next May. So thank you, everybody. Thanks, Nolan and Stephen, for being here today.
Thank you.